The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, slipped neatly into the brass mailbox at the end of the driveway like it belonged there. Thick, official, heavy in a way that told its story before it was ever opened. Keanu Reeves noticed it immediately. He hadn't been expecting anything. No bills overdue, no packages, no letters from fans. Just a plain white envelope stamped with a bold, unmistakable seal of the Homeowners Association. He carried it inside without urgency, set it on the wooden kitchen table, and made coffee as if it were any other day. Only when the steam curled into the morning light did he finally open it. His eyes moved slowly across the page, line by line, until they stopped. Notice of violation. Total fine. $50,000. For a moment, the house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. $50,000. The number didn't make sense. Not for the reason listed below it. Unauthorized community use and structural non-compliance. According to the HOA, Keanu had violated multiple bylaws by allowing non-residents to access his driveway and by making unapproved alterations to his property. The alteration in question, a simple wooden bench near his fence and a small shaded area where neighborhood kids often sat while waiting for their parents. No permanent structure, no damage, no prior warning, just a fine large enough to scare most homeowners into immediate compliance, or worse, into selling their home. Word spread through the neighborhood before noon. A few residents gathered near the mailbox cluster, whispering in disbelief. Some had lived there for decades and had never seen a fine over a few $100s. $50,000 was unheard of. One elderly neighbor shook her head, muttering that this wasn't about rules anymore, it was about power. Everyone knew the HOA board had grown aggressive over the past year, especially the president, who had been targeting certain homes with strange inspections and selective enforcement. Still, no one expected them to come after Keanu like this. Not over something so small, not so publicly. That evening, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. Keanu attended quietly, sitting in the back of the room while the board members spoke in rehearsed tones. The president, a sharply dressed woman with a cold smile, read the violation aloud as if announcing a verdict. When someone asked whether the fine could be reduced, she didn't hesitate. "Absolutely not," she said. "Rules are rules, and no one is above them." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Keanu, daring him to respond. He didn't. He simply nodded once, thanked the board for their time, and walked out without saying a word. To them, his silence looked like defeat. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Over the next few days, the HOA escalated quickly. Follow-up letters arrived, each one more threatening than the last. Late fees were added. Legal language appeared in bold type, *liens*, foreclosure, asset seizure. Neighbors watched nervously, some afraid to even wave at Keanu, worried they might become targets themselves. The HOA president was overheard telling another board member, "He'll pay." They always do. What she didn't realize was that Keanu wasn't ignoring the problem. He was observing it. Every letter, every date, every clause referenced. He kept them neatly organized, unreadable to anyone else, but perfectly clear to him. Late one night, long after the neighborhood lights had gone out, Keanu sat at his desk with the HOA documents spread before him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. He was focused. Something about the fine bothered him, not just the amount, but the way it had been issued. No warning, no prior notice, no opportunity to correct the so-called violation. It felt less like enforcement and more like a calculated move. As he flipped through the HOA bylaws, a faint smile touched his face. The board had made one critical mistake. They had assumed he would react emotionally. They had assumed he would argue. They had assumed wrong. Outside, the neighborhood slept peacefully, unaware that everything was about to change. The HOA thought they had backed the quiet homeowner into a corner. They believed the $50,000 fine was the end of the story. In reality, it was only the beginning. And the moment Keanu set the documents down and reached for his phone, one thing became clear. This fight would not be loud, but it would be final. The second notice arrived less than 48 hours after the first, this time delivered by certified mail. It was thicker, colder in tone, and deliberately intimidating. The headline alone felt like a warning shot, final demand before legal action. According to the HOA, Keanu Reeves now owed not only the original $50,000, but an additional $2,000 in administrative penalties. A new line had been added at the bottom in bold type. Asterisk daily fines of $1,000 will continue until full compliance is achieved. Asterisk the message was unmistakable. Pay up or we will take your home. Keanu read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it on top of the others. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet anxiety. This wasn't enforcement anymore. It was intimidation. That weekend, the HOA held another meeting, this one mandatory. Attendance was unusually high, not because residents wanted to be there, but because they were afraid not to be. The president stood at the front of the room, flanked by two board members who nodded at everything she said. When Keanu's case was mentioned, the tone shifted. She spoke slowly, carefully, choosing words meant to sting. Repeated non-compliance, she said. Refusal to cooperate. A clear disregard for community standards. A few people glanced back at Keanu, expecting anger, an outburst, something. He gave them none. He sat still, hands folded, eyes calm. When the president asked if he had anything to say, he simply replied, I'd like a complete copy of the HOA bylaws, financial statements for the past 5 years, and records of all fines issued in this community. The room went quiet. The request wasn't emotional. It was surgical. The board didn't like that. Within days, new inspections appeared on Keanu's property. Photos were taken from odd angles. Notes were left on his gate citing vague concerns. One even claimed his driveway was being used for unauthorized gatherings, despite there being no evidence of such a thing. Neighbors began receiving warnings too, subtle ones. Support Keanu, and your home might be next. Some backed away out of fear. Others whispered their support behind closed doors, admitting they'd been fined unfairly before but had never had the courage to fight back. The HOA thrived on that fear. They believed pressure would break him the way it had broken everyone else. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. The HOA reluctantly sent over the requested documents, assuming Keanu wouldn't understand them or wouldn't bother to read them closely. They were wrong on both counts. Each page told a story, not just of rules and procedures, but of patterns. Certain homes fined repeatedly. Certain contractors paid generously. Certain violations enforced selectively. Late one night, Keanu sat with a legal advisor, quietly pointing out sections of the bylaws that contradicted the actions taken against him. There were caps on fines, mandatory warning periods, voting requirements that had been skipped entirely. The advisor leaned back in his chair and said softly, they shouldn't have done this. Meanwhile, the HOA president grew more confident. She bragged openly during meetings that the situation would set an example. She told residents that resisting the board was pointless. We always win, she said with a smile. What she didn't know was that her own signature appeared on several questionable approvals buried deep in the financial records. Payments routed to the same small group of vendors. Contracts renewed without community votes. Expenses labeled as maintenance that never resulted in repairs. The deeper Keanu looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about him. The $50,000 fine was part of something much larger. By the end of the week, the pressure reached its peak. A notice of intent to place a lien on Keanu's property was prepared, waiting only for final board approval. The HOA believed they had him cornered. But as Keanu closed the final folder and stacked the evidence neatly on his desk, his expression didn't show fear. It showed resolve. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't defended himself publicly. He had done something far more dangerous to people like them. He had learned their rules better than they knew them themselves. And with that knowledge, he was ready to make one move, just one, that would bring everything crashing down. The documents arrived in 3 heavy boxes, dropped unceremoniously on Keanu's front porch by a courier who looked relieved to be rid of them. Inside were years of HOA records, financial statements, violation logs, vendor contracts, meeting minutes, everything the board assumed would overwhelm and discourage him. Instead, Keanu carried the boxes inside with quiet purpose, lining them up along the wall of his study like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. He didn't rush. He didn't skim. He read carefully, page by page, highlighting small inconsistencies that most people would miss, dates that didn't align, amounts that seemed just a little too round, names that appeared again and again in places they shouldn't. At first, the patterns were subtle. Certain residents were fined repeatedly for minor issues, trash cans, paint shades, garden placement, while others were never cited at all. The fines themselves grew steeper over time, often bypassing the warning stages required by the bylaws. Then came the vendor contracts. Landscaping, security, maintenance, each service appeared to be outsourced to a small cluster of companies. Digging deeper, Keanu noticed something troubling. Several of those companies shared the same mailing address. One even listed a phone number that matched a personal contact saved in the HOA president's own correspondence. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. The most disturbing discovery came late one night, when Keanu cross-referenced violation notices with property transfers in the county records. Homes that had received unusually large fines, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, often ended up sold within months, usually below market value. In more than one case, the buyer was an investment group connected indirectly to the same vendors paid by the HOA. The realization settled heavily in the room. The fines weren't about compliance. They were leverage. A way to pressure homeowners into selling when they couldn't keep up. Keanu's $50,000 fine wasn't an outlier, it was a test. And they had chosen the wrong person. As the evidence stacked higher, Keanu's legal advisor grew increasingly quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mix of disbelief and concern. "This goes beyond an abusive HOA," he said. "This looks like organized misconduct, possibly fraud." Together, they documented everything: screenshots, copies, timelines, building a clean, undeniable narrative. The board had violated their own bylaws repeatedly. They had exceeded legal limits on fines. They had approved contracts without resident votes. Worst of all, they had personally benefited from those approvals. Every step was documented. Every signature accounted for. While Keanu worked in silence, the HOA president grew louder. Confident that foreclosure was inevitable, she announced during a meeting that delinquent residents would soon face serious consequences. She didn't mention Keanu by name, but everyone knew who she meant. Her tone was triumphant, almost celebratory. What she didn't know was that her own emails, casually forwarded, carelessly archived, were now part of a growing file labeled simply Exhibit A. In one message, she joked about forcing stubborn homeowners to blink first. In another, she discussed increasing fines to speed things along. Each line erased any doubt about intent. The final piece fell into place when Keanu's advisor uncovered a clause buried deep in state law, one the HOA board had either ignored or hoped no one would notice. Any association issuing fines beyond a specific threshold without due process could be subjected to an immediate court-ordered audit and suspension of authority. It was rare, powerful, and devastating if invoked correctly. Keanu leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile returning. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even surprised. He was ready. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual. Lawns trimmed, lights glowing warmly behind curtains, unaware that the foundation of the HOA's power was already cracking. The board thought they were days away from victory. In reality, they were hours away from exposure. Keanu closed the final folder, picked up his phone, and made one call. Not to argue, not to settle, but to begin the process that would freeze everything the HOA thought it controlled. They had turned a $50,000 fine into a confession. The legal filing went through just after sunrise, submitted quietly and without ceremony. No press release, no public statement, just a single precisely worded motion filed with the county court, an emergency injunction request paired with a mandatory forensic audit petition. To anyone unfamiliar with HOA law, it looked procedural, almost boring. But to those who understood its implications, it was a loaded weapon. If granted, it would immediately suspend the HOA's authority, freeze its bank accounts, and open every financial decision to court scrutiny. Keanu's legal team didn't dramatize it. They let the law speak for itself. The HOA board found out an hour later. The president was in the middle of approving the lien paperwork on Keanu's home when her phone began vibrating non-stop. By the third call, her confident smile had faded. The message was short and devastating. All enforcement actions are to cease immediately. Within minutes, emails poured in from the HOA's attorney, suddenly cautious, suddenly formal. He advised the board not to contact Keanu directly, not to issue further fines, and not to move any funds. Confusion spread through the room. One board member asked if this was some kind of delay tactic. Another demanded to know how a single homeowner could halt an entire association. No one answered, because the truth was sinking in. He hadn't challenged the fine. He had challenged their legitimacy. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the very next day. It wasn't a full trial, just a preliminary review to determine whether the injunction should stand. Still, the courtroom was packed. Residents filled the benches, drawn by rumors that something big was happening. The HOA president arrived flanked by legal counsel, her posture rigid, her confidence forced. Keanu entered quietly from the side, dressed simply, acknowledging no one, taking his seat without a word. When the judge asked for a summary, Keanu's attorney stood and spoke calmly, outlining the pattern of excessive fines, selective enforcement, and financial irregularities. Each claim was backed by a document, a signature, a date. No speculation, no emotion. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge interrupted the HOA's attorney mid-sentence and asked a single question. Can you explain why these fines exceed the statutory limit outlined in Section 8.4? The room went still. The attorney glanced at the president, then back at the judge. He tried to pivot, referencing community standards and board discretion, but the judge wasn't interested. One by one, the documents were reviewed. Emails, contracts, financial statements. The judge's expression hardened. Finally, he leaned forward and said the words no HOA board ever wants to hear. This court is granting the emergency injunction effective immediately. The impact was instant. All HOA enforcement powers were suspended. Bank accounts were frozen pending audit. The board was prohibited from issuing fines, liens, or notices of any kind. A court-appointed auditor was assigned full access to records and authority to interview board members under oath. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The HOA president's face drained of color as she realized what had just happened. This wasn't a delay. This was a shutdown. She tried to speak, to object, but her attorney gently pulled her back into her seat. There was nothing left to argue. Outside the courthouse, reporters began gathering, alerted by residents who finally felt safe enough to talk. Questions flew, cameras clicked, and whispers turned into headlines. Keanu didn't stop to comment. He walked past the microphones, calm as ever, and got into his car. Inside, he allowed himself one slow breath. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't demanded justice. He had simply asked the law to look closely. And once it did, everything unraveled. Back at the neighborhood, the HOA office sat dark for the first time in years. No letters went out. No fines were posted. No threats were issued. The board that once ruled through fear had been silenced in a single day. And as residents began to realize what had happened, one truth became clear. The $50,000 fine had never been about compliance. It had been the spark. Asterisk, and with one legal move, Keanu Reeves had turned it into the beginning of the end. The audit began quietly, but moved with relentless precision. Court-appointed investigators arrived at the HOA office early Monday morning, changing locks and cataloging every file, every computer, every financial record. Board members were instructed to surrender passwords and devices, their access revoked with a formality that left no room for argument. What had once been a place of authority now felt like a crime scene. Residents watched from across the street, some in disbelief, others with a sense of relief they hadn't felt in years. The HOA that had ruled through fear was suddenly powerless, and the silence it left behind was almost peaceful. Within weeks, the findings began to surface, and they were worse than anyone expected. The audit revealed a web of misconduct stretching back nearly a decade. Millions of dollars in HOA funds had been misallocated through inflated contracts and shell companies connected to board members and their relatives. Fines had been issued selectively, targeting homeowners who questioned decisions or refused to sell. In several cases, properties forced into foreclosure were later acquired by investment groups with indirect ties to the same vendors the HOA paid. The $50,000 fine against Keanu was no anomaly. It was simply the most aggressive attempt yet. This time, the target didn't blink. The legal consequences followed swiftly. The HOA president was removed from her position and charged with multiple counts, including fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. 2 other board members resigned under investigation, while another accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony. Their attorney, once so confident, issued a brief statement and declined further comment. For the first time, residents saw accountability where there had only ever been threats. Court orders mandated full restitution. Every improperly issued fine was to be refunded, with interest. For many families, it meant thousands of dollars returned, money they had once paid out of fear. A special community meeting was held in the local hall, not run by the HOA, but by an independent mediator appointed by the court. The atmosphere was different, lighter, almost emotional. Residents spoke openly about years of intimidation, about how close some had come to losing their homes. When Keanu stood to speak, the room fell silent. He didn't criticize. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "No one should feel afraid in their own home. This wasn't about me. It was about all of you." Then he sat back down. The applause that followed wasn't loud at first, but it grew, steady and sincere. Keanu refused any personal compensation beyond the dismissal of his fine. Instead, he proposed something unexpected. Using his own funds, he helped establish a resident protection trust, designed to provide legal support and oversight for future community governance. The court approved it unanimously. New HOA elections were scheduled under strict supervision, with transparency measures written directly into the bylaws. Limits on fines were clearly defined. Audits became mandatory. Power, once concentrated in a few hands, was finally distributed back to the people it was meant to serve. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Kids sat on the same wooden bench that had started everything, laughing without fear of violations or fines. Neighbors waved again. Gardens grew freely. The HOA office reopened months later, staffed by volunteers and overseen by professionals who answered to the community, not the other way around. The old president's name was removed from every document, every plaque, every record of authority she once held. On a quiet evening, long after the headlines faded, Keanu walked through the neighborhood one last time before heading home. He passed the mailbox where the $50,000 fine had first arrived. It looked ordinary now, harmless. He paused for a moment, then kept walking. He hadn't set out to fight a system. He had simply refused to be bullied by it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone of something easy to forget. Real power doesn't shout, threaten, or intimidate. Real power stands firm, lets the truth speak, and walks away when justice is done.